question I have is, well, I have two questions. One with regard to your model and the sort of the independent variable being this density of sort of civil society groups that are devoted to law and so forth. You treat it solely as a kind of quantitative measurement, how many of these groups there are and so forth. But aren't they just as divided as the elites would be? In other words, aren't there also civil society groups, and particularly legalistic groups, given where they come from in a society, that would be more interested in the sort of corporate position, say on something like pollution, than they would be in the rights of the population affected by them. So if you use only a sort of a measurement of how dense the network of these NGOs is, you catch that. And then the second question is, I was a little confused on the outcome versus output. I was sort of expecting, and I granted the time frame, that the output was supposed to be higher in terms of the first case, the river case, and why it was actually lower. I mean, the outputs in both cases, but the outcome, I thought it was leading to the idea that it would actually generate change beyond simply the outputs of the case itself, narrow compliance.
Okay. So, thank you for the question. So perhaps if I show you this, sort of a more, so here's a more careful laydown of how I think of the legal constituency for the Cauca Mendoza. So it is partly a quantitative assessment, but it's not entirely a quantitative assessment. I mean, I look at the number of organizations, but I do really sort of careful, more descriptive work, particularly in the dissertation, about how it is that they had worked before and on what topics they had worked before. So the answer to your question is twofold. On the one hand, it's not entirely quantitative in that I do I'm interested in what type, how they had worked together, and sort of in what direction in terms of the issue at hand, and in particular the river issue. But also, what is true is that there are other organizations that have different interests, and they also come to play in the collaborative oversight arena. But I think that's part of what the court is looking for, and that the process is looking for, that people with very divergent interests come together and have these discussions. In general, the people the organizations that I look at in terms of the legal constituency are all in favor of sort of the advancement of the right in these terms. But when you set up the spaces more broadly, there are, and you're right, other organizations that come in that may have a different sort of outlook on the issue. But that's part of the process, the discussion that is generated in that space. So that's the first one. And the second one, the output and the outcome. So the fact that the output is high and the outcome is low for the river. So two things regarding that. They don't necessarily go in lockstep, and they don't go in lockstep partly because of time, right? So I think it's just too early at this point to ask of this process a high outcome. I cannot guarantee that it is going to happen, but I think part of the discussion when we think about impact that we have to have this in mind, because if we discount it just from the start, then we're asking too much of what needs to happen with the process. So I can understand that it would start, but I think it's part of the process that I want to draw attention to in terms of.
Would you, if the river is cleaned up and if the situation improves over the course of time, how would you isolate the impact of the court ruling on that? I mean, wouldn't there be other things at play that would have?
That's true. So that's also a good point, and I sort of in my visualization how I think about impact, I clearly sort of account for the possibility. I'm not here to claim that this is the only way that rights effectiveness sort of comes about through the intervention of the court. But I think through careful process tracing, it is sort of possible to isolate that at least certain types of interventions are associated with changes that came from the court. And this is sort of what I hope to do, but I wouldn't claim either that if the situation improves over time, it is entirely dependent to that. But you can see, and for example, in particular, the industrial contamination control programs, the reconversion of the industries in the river basin, those started specifically because of the court's intervention. So we know that if anything happens on that front, it's because the industrial reconversion programs that started after 2009 and 2010. So I think there's areas in which we can track. Your name, I'm so sorry.
I'm Richard.
Hi, Richard, please.
The way I like to summarize it is important, incredibly, very exciting, and it's really interesting to think about the role the courts can play in change. As you say, it doesn't have to be standards that are identified in this model of the court. The court can play a new role, and it's very interesting. But I do wonder about moving away from sort of a democratic form in this way. You said some rights you have to talk, and you wonder to define them. For me, I think about it as saying outside the political process. So, like freedom of speech, and there's already been fought against is there, do you see a danger in having such an expanded notion of right? How specifically you define it, including policy? So you can work with people to the left, and you're saying, you can also go in countries that maybe right, right of corporation, maybe unjust form. So I was asking the question of how the courts are created and developed, and how maybe we're going to talk Latin America, but just to take the whole question, how do you find right? And in Harold, but these very content-based notions of right, as opposed to more formal notions of right out there, rather than having something beyond the process.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is what makes this topic so fascinating, right? It's because after the wave of sort of constitutional reforms in Latin America in particular that entrenched sort of the second generation of rights beyond sort of what we understand, particularly as sort of the political rights, and entrenched this whole host of multicultural, socio-economic, but also cultural rights into this constitution. So where does it end? Where does it stop? What I think is that this is precisely why the topic is so crucial, because the implementation of these issues and the discussion of the content of these rights is an eminently political discussion. For political from several perspectives, sort of from how the court decides how far the right goes, but also because of the consequences that this has for policy. So it's a double dimension. I don't think even the courts in many of these countries have a clean answer, and they have taken dramatically different approaches. For example, the South African has a very different approach to the Colombian one, which is the Colombian one is more content driven, while the South African one has sort of stayed more back and just simply pushed the government on showing some sort of progress, but not defining the content. So I don't have a specific definition of the content, except for sort of looking carefully at what the Constitution itself specifies, which in many cases is not clear. But I think that's precisely what makes them so fundamental, because in this process, it's where we're seeing the boundaries of how far courts can go, and the boundaries of rights themselves being negotiated within each court. Ron,
One of the things I was curious about, the courts have the ability to set up monitoring devices, and they could do this in any case, right? So what percentage of cases do they do that in? And to what degree, what sort of determines, right? Because it seems to me that's a really important part of your argument, right? Is that the role of these monitoring devices. And so I'm just sort of curious how often it happens, and why do they do it in some cases and not others? Are there sort of the political, right? The fact that if we try to do it here, we're going to fail, there's going to be too much pushback, or, right? So, yeah, those
okay.
are.
So this is the question that keeps me up at night too, as well. And I think it's slightly outside of the realm of this particular project, but it is a crucial one. So I can say this: it's not always. So let me make the distinction between first the big landmark cases and the small sort of individual litigation. I focus on landmark cases. which are not, I mean, the scope of this one, there are not that many. I don't know the specific percentage in which they use monitoring, but they tend to be really big endeavors, so we're not talking like, it's not that they use it in 50% of the cases. I wouldn't know the specific, but it doesn't reach 50% to give you a concrete answer. Now, why? What we do know is that there's a lot of, so the first court that started using this monitoring mechanisms is the Indian Supreme Court, which has the longest track record with using them, and it's the biggest case that they've used so far, has 18 years sort of in the making. And what we do know is that this is what little we know is that it's a judge-driven process. There's a lot of discussions and conversations between these justices sort of at an international level, and particularly within Latin America. So they're talking between them, and because they're increasingly faced with the socioeconomic rights cases, they're looking for ways to tackle this structural issue in a different way. And they're relying on what they see their counterparts in other courts, in other countries, and that's why they sometimes are experimenting with this monitoring mechanism. Now, so this is for the structural cases. For the individual cases, there's courts like the Costa Rican who routinely do follow up through the phone, on the phone. So they're doing random sampling of their cases, and they have an entire office dedicated to phoning. And they go through their random sample of cases, and it's like, did you get what you needed? Blah, blah, blah. So it happens sort of on both levels. I think it's a judge-driven process, and I think it's a fascinating next project to work on. But I cannot go ahead and but these are sort of my thoughts on the general.
Sure.
Thank you. I saw Chris, and then
I've got two related questions. You mentioned Rosenberg and Apollo both.
yes.
Part of his argument is that legal rulings can alter the interest group universe afterwards, can alter the constituency in your terms. And so I'm wondering first whether legal constituency is a constant or a variable over time, and to what extent it truly is an independent variable in your account. And secondly, part of his argument is that the court cases can mobilize people for and against the ruling. And, for example, many of the main anti-abortion groups developed right after Roe versus Wade. I'm wondering to what extent you look at and consider the role of opposition groups, business groups, et cetera, perhaps in your Argentinian case, who also get involved and may make your story more complicated or more interesting.
Both at the same time. So, legal constituency first. So you're absolutely right.
That's all I need to know. Go ahead.
Okay, next question. To the legal constituency first. It is, so this is why I don't think of legal constituencies in terms of there are or there aren't. Because in these big cases, what we know is that in most of the cases, there were already people working on these topics before. So it would be foolish to say that there was nothing there, because there is. But what I think this is what process tracing is so good at, is sort of that being able to disentangle the changes that happened after the ruling. So I would agree with Rosenberg completely, and in this I agree with Michael McCann too, that the rulings themselves have an effect on the people that work on these issues, and we can differentiate them. But what you see after these rulings is that participating in these types of monitoring mechanisms actually create more dense networks between these organizations that may have known each other and sort of worked with each other before, but in this new context, it brings their interactions and their synergies to a different level. So I'm interested in tracking that, and I think through the process tracing, I can do some of that, and it's part of the interesting effects of the organizational change. So there's some sort of melding that can happen, and I can see the concern, but I think the process tracing sort of allows them to look at that process carefully. So that's the first one. And the second one is the negative, the other types of effects or development. So that's two sort of quick points on that one. First, again, you're right, and you sort of see that this also triggers processes in people who are differently oriented towards the advancement of the rights. So collaborative oversight think that's one of the challenges of sustaining them over time. But looking at the backlash, at what actually happens with these organizations is what I want to do for the next project. Because studying them is that I realize that some of these things happen. So part of what I want to do for the next research is to study backlash exactly. I look at some of it in terms of the negative externalities of the collaborative oversight arena, sort of on a case by case basis, but I want to study it more generally for the next John, Marcus, and Steve. Yes, and then everyone. So just putting this before everybody. John.
So in talking about legal constituency in the talk, we focused on NGOs and government oversight agencies network. Last night over dinner you mentioned that one of the interesting things about both the cases that you mentioned here, but also the Costa Rican case, is the relative ease of access to the high courts on the part of ordinary citizens.
Yep.
Right? And so I was wondering what, if any, role that facet of the judicial system in these countries plays in its story, right? Maybe at the more kind of individual ordinary citizen level, because we have much more likely to see this kind of organizations like NGOs.
So what role the ease of access of the courts play?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I think all those. I'm going to say all the roles in the world, but that's not an accurate. I think it's crucial. Because otherwise, for several reasons, because I do think that it makes a crucial difference the types of cases that these courts are constantly exposed to. So the fact that citizens can easily sort of shift demands to the court exposes the court to all these issues. I think that shifts the way that they think about and decide, that the justices think about and decide on their rulings and the types of things that they are sort of concerned with. So that's one. I think it also shifts the incentive structure even for many of the government officials, that you can so easily access the court, because in many of, particularly Latin America, what you have are legislatures that are not very responsive, right? So the crisis of the crisis of democratic representation in Latin America, because citizens are turning to courts because they're not getting the answer from the legislature and from other scenarios. So I think we wouldn't be seeing many of these things as the access to the courts for justice. Marcus?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you talk a little bit about why we get this court case when we do. So, just generally speaking, your argument seems to be that the courts facilitate some type of change in the political or social structure, and that these decisions have all these effects. But I would imagine somebody could say, well, wait a second, the fact that you get the court case at all is indicative of political change and social change. So is it a case where there's a tipping point that's reached and something happens and then the case gets heard and so therefore, other things get kicked off? Or is the case really doing something on its own where it's catalyzing the court? In other words, if this riverbed's being sort of polluted for centuries, why at that particular point in time do we see that in this case?
Okay. So I think it would be naive to deny sort of the previous political or social mobilization in many of these cases around this topic. But what's interesting, I think, sort of from looking at the perspective of the impact of the ruling, is that we know, and this, in the case of Argentina, I have to be clear, we know that the river basin was polluted and degraded, and people have been trying to do stuff with it for 200 years, and absolutely nothing has happened, right? And this is a recurring theme, sort of in the interviews with the people. And it's like more has gotten done in 4 years than in the 200 that we had been trying to get anyone to pay attention to this topic. So I would be foolish of me to stand here and tell you, no one had tried to even touch the topic either. And that's even the case, for example, with the other high impact ruling, the one that I have in Colombia, right? So the health system, like, it has been on a serious crisis for the last 20 years since it was first reformed. But what we know, like from talking to the people, is that the minute that the court intervenes, it opens up a space for changes that had not been possible earlier. So I think these are larger processes of sociopolitical change. And maybe we start thinking about them in those terms, or what contribution the court makes, but not pretend that it's the only one, then that sort of gets us thinking about social political change in a different way. Or at least this is how I'm interested in sort of understanding the contribution in the larger way. Proceed.
I have a couple questions. One of them is, it's a little bit in line with both what John and, or Ed was asking. So first I have just a really factual question. So how are these justices getting their jobs? Are they all appointed? Is there variation in your study?
There's variation in their appointment mechanism. So, the Colombian, very quickly, a real rundown of appointment mechanisms in Colombia and Argentina. So in Colombia, they are nominated by the president, in Argentina, they are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, 2/3 majority, appointment for life, they have to retire at 72 or 65, one of the two. In Colombia, it's a little different. So there's 9 justices, 3 are nominated by the president, again, confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate. 3 are nominated by the Supreme Court of Justice, and 3 are nominated by the Judicial Council. So it's and in Colombia they have very short terms, 9 years, but it's very interesting because short terms in Colombia and other couple of places have been shown to also foster a lot of independence, which goes counter to what we normally think in the U.S. So
I guess are any of them elected?
no.
Because I think part of what goes on in the United States with this question, of course, is this subverting of the democratic process, right? The fact that you have these appointed folks making these decisions. And I think certainly in the last 20 years or so, that's led to all this debate on the issue, really, of the issue of these judicially active judges making these decisions. And so you answered part of my question with just saying, why are these groups going to the court in the first place? I mean, we've got new constitutions, but have they persisted in legislatures for long periods of time and failed to get changed? Are they attempting to get change at some other structural level of the courts and not having success? Any of the cases, I mean, I think particularly the question of same-sex marriage in the U.S. is interesting because of the focus and the use of the federal system, right, in order to get the kind of change we've got. So that's part of my question. And then my other bigger question is just sort of, if Rosenberg was sitting here, am I right to say that he would say, you just confirmed my theory? I mean, I can see him making an argument that, so right now, I mean, we haven't had enough time with the environmental case,
Yep.
but low outcome right now.
Okay.
And whether you're seeing the high outcome, and is it the court that is a focal point and not the instrument for social change? I'm not sure. I guess I'm wondering how far field you really are from.
Right. But so let me start with Rosenberg, one of my favorite books in the whole world. No, I love that book. I think that guy's a genius. So the thing is that Rosenberg thinks that the U.S. Supreme Court is a flypaper court, right? That NGOs and legal advocacy organizations in the U.S. are wasting their time going to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I am in fundamental disagreement with that idea. Because for 2 reasons. First, perhaps he understands, in fact, because he's focusing on nationwide significant reform, and that's it. I think Rosenberg sort of pays less attention, or pays the attention that he wants to pay to other types of sort of ideational and symbolic change. So I think that's a really important part of the story. And I would have a very different reading, for example, of the impact of Brown report and some of the cases that he studied. And I don't think, so from that perspective, I don't think that it's political. I think that this is not wasted energy. I think that when we think again, sort of if we take a wider look, this is actually changing many, particularly how the policy areas are being configured broadly. So I can see the point that you're making, but I give you a satisfactory because I only have so many few years, but this is where I'm coming at it from now.
So I wondered, right, on the, is there a comparative case that you could look at where the scientists could predict, like, how much you would expect to, how much change you'd expect to see in the river, kind of given certain, right, so that maybe that could help you on that front. I don't know, it's hard because in every different context you go to a different country, right, there are different, you know, regulations and, the ability to comply, but, so I thought that was one possibility I thought about, but I wanted, I was interested in hearing the cases where you have high civil society or legal constituency mobilization, but not the oversight. How does that case differ from where you have the oversight mechanisms, but not the active legal constituency? How would that differ on terms of the output, and if you would expect to see any outcome in?
So what you see, so let's give you a concrete example. One of the other Argentina cases, which is the social detention, sort of seeking to safeguard the right to pensions of the elderly population in Argentina, which the government has consistently refused to update, right? The court held, like, following the crisis, no, you have to update pensions and keep these people living below certain poverty because you refuse to index the pension calculation. So what you see in general, sort of in these cases, is that you see all the mobilization that these groups do afterwards, and that can happen, but you see none of the access to the institutional spaces where the decisions are being made or the policies are being reformed. So at its core, this court has formulated a project, and what is interesting is that you see the mobilization, you see all the legal constituencies like making noise in the good sense of the word, but you don't see any of the synergies that are really possible in the context of the collaborative oversight arena.
So there's no change in norms?
None of that. Or the input sort of in terms of tweaking policy or the ability to sort of have a discussion with the people that are making policy, that we don't see any of that. So this is very general terms, but this is sort of what I observed in both of them.
Is there any variation among the cases you look at or courts of in terms of the institutional authority given to their ability?
So, so yes, there is. Okay, yes. So yes, there is. But interestingly, if you look, because there's a nice measure of the scope of authority of courts in Latin America. It was built a couple of years ago. And what you actually see is that the Argentinian court has a higher authority than the Colombian one in terms of its institutional design. And of course, mine is not